So, a team of researchers believe that they may have finally solved one of America's greatest mysteries. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? If you want to skip ahead to the answer, skip to this time in the video. If you want to come along for the lols or just want to refresh on the story, let's get going. In 1585, an English explorer named Sir Walter Raleigh sent a militarized group to North America to set up a fort on Roanoke Island, an island just off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The settlement's purpose was to be the first English colony in North America, and to raid Spanish ships. So it wasn't all butterflies and rainbows. Then the next year, in 1586, this colony started running low on supplies and food after several battles with the locals, and they would actually end up abandoning the settlement on Roanoke after multiple resupply efforts failed. But then 2 weeks after they left, a guy named Sir Richard Grenville would arrive on Roanoke and would leave supplies and about 15 men on the island. These men were never seen alive again. Sir Walter Raleigh then thought, let's try set up a colony further north in the Chesapeake Bay area, which would be present-day Virginia, believing that that area was a more promising place to settle because the soil was better. He then tasked a guy named John White with establishing this settlement. John White was then able to convince about 113 other people to join him, including his daughter Eleanor and his son-in-law Ananias Dare. Sir Walter Raleigh was like, wow dude, you did it, and then named John White the chief governor of this new colony. Then in May 1587, John White and his colonists set off for Virginia. They were guided by the Portuguese navigator Simeão Fernandes, the same pilot who navigated for Sir Richard Grenville when he dropped off those 15 guys on Roanoke that were never seen again. Now, it is unclear why, but Simeão Fernandes' nickname was the Swine. This was either because the English colonists were racist, or because Simeão was a dickhead. Perhaps it was both, but it's important to note that at one point, Simeão was an actual pirate, and he was arrested for piracy, and at the time, piracy was punishable by hanging. However, because he usually raided Spanish ships, the principal secretary to Queen Elizabeth I had Simeão Fernandes released, seeing him more as an asset and less of an asshole. But Simeão was an asshole, a big one, because John White's destination was not actually Roanoke Island. It was Chesapeake Bay, but Simeão took these guys to Roanoke anyway. When they finally arrived at Roanoke Island and the colonists disembarked the ship, they realized, hold up, wait a minute, this is the wrong place. But the Swine and his crew refused to let the colonists back on the ship. The motive for this is unclear, but it's assumed it's either because he wanted to go be a pirate again, or more specifically, he wanted to go be a privateer, which is a private person or vessel that is commissioned by a government during wartime to attack and capture enemy ships, essentially acting as a government-sanctioned pirate with legal protection. That, or he was just a cunt. Anyway, according to John White's journal, Simeão said something like, quote, "Summer was far spent, wherefore he would land all the planters in no other place," end quote. Which basically means that summer was over and he would not look for a better place to disembark the colonists. Well, faced with what was essentially a mutiny by his navigator, John White appears to have backed down and agreed that the colonists could stay on Roanoke at least temporarily. And so this second colony of Roanoke then set out to start repairing the structures left behind in 1585. Now, while on the island, John White made contact with a friendly tribe of locals who were led by Chief Manteo, a Croatan Native American. The Croatan were a small Native American tribe who lived in present-day Dare County, and Dare County would be quite a large area that covered the Alligator River, the Croatan Sound, Roanoke Island, the Ocracoke Island, the Outer Banks, and an island called Hatteras Island, which was previously known as Croatoan Island. Well, everyone who knows the rest of the story probably just said, oh, well, that explains the tree then. Yes, it does. Well, anyway, Chief Manteo then told John White that those other 15 men that Sir Richard Grenville left behind were killed by Secretan warriors, who were enemies of the Croatans. It's been speculated that due to the tensions between the Secretans and the English colonists, the Croatans saw an opportunity to become allies with the English to overpower the Secretans. But who knows? But what we do know is the second colony of Roanoke's food supplies started running out, and since the colony was marooned at Roanoke rather than the Chesapeake Bay area, the supply ships from England would not have known that Simeão was an asshole and left them on Roanoke Island. So there was a fear that the Roanoke settlement might not survive the coming winter, and not to mention there was now an extra pressure because John White had just become a grandfather. His daughter Eleanor had just given birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. So the settlers started pressing White to do something, quote, for the better and sooner obtaining of supplies and other necessaries, end quote. Now John White was a bit reluctant to abandon his colony though, because he thought his haters back in England would, quote, not spare to slander him falsely, and also that his stuff and goods might be spoiled and most of it pilfered away. But eventually John White would leave, but he wanted it to be known that it was very much against his will. And this is the part in the story where everything goes to shit. When John White tried to set sail, the anchor of his little flyboat, his European light vessel, was stuck and they couldn't raise it. While trying to fix this anchor, several of White's crew members hurt themselves quite badly. Then, after they set sail, as is tradition in all unsolved mysteries, their journey was delayed by bad weather. Because of this delay, several crew members died of scurvy or starvation, but John White would eventually make it all the way back to England, and when he made it back to Southampton, he found out that Queen Elizabeth had just issued a general stay of shipping, which meant that no ships could depart from English shores. Now the reason for this was because of the invincible Spanish Armada, which would later prove to be quite vincible when they were defeated by bad weather. As is of course tradition in Unsolved Mysteries. The English though, they also wanted it to be known that they had something to do with it of course. Which is of course tradition with the English. Who writes this fucking shit? The answer is me. I write this, unfortunately. Now, there's way more to this disaster of a rescue effort, because in early 1588, John White finally arranged for a pair of small pinnacles, which were actually large vessels, and these two pinnacles were called the Brave and the Roe. They were unsuitable for military service, so they could be spared for this expedition back to Roanoke. On the way back, they were attacked by French pirates. John White and his crew managed to escape, but the pirates, quote, robbed us of all our victuals, powder, weapons, and provision. So their journey had to be abandoned. At this point, John White formed the belief that he was, quote, born under an unlucky star. Clearly, because it gets worse. Finally, in March 1590, with the threat of the Spanish invasion now gone, Sir Walter Raleigh was able to secure two more ships for John White, the Hopewell and the Moonlight, and John White and his new crew quickly set sail again for Roanoke. The journey back to Roanoke was prolonged by several sea battles, where they fought off pirates and privateers. When they eventually made it to the Outer Banks, as is tradition, they were hit with bad weather. The weather and currents were so bad that when they tried to land at Roanoke, 7 people drowned. I don't really know why they just didn't wait until the weather calmed down. But when John White finally put foot back on Roanoke on August 18, 1590, his granddaughter Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, he noticed that his entire colony was now missing. The buildings had collapsed and the houses were taken down. Now, of the few clues left behind of the colonists' whereabouts, John White found the letter C-R-O carved into a tree, and the word Croatoan carved on a post of the fort. As previously mentioned, Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, the present-day Hatteras Island, and it was also the name of their allies, the local Croatan Native Americans. Now, if you're wondering, why was John White looking at trees when he noticed his colony was missing? Well, on account of them not having emails or social media or DMs, since this is 1590, and since Roanoke was not the original planned location for this colony, the idea of moving elsewhere had actually been discussed before. So before John White left, he and his colonists had agreed that a message would be carved into a tree if they had moved. And this message would include an image of a Maltese cross if the decision was made by force. John White noted, however, that there was no Maltese cross in this message on the tree, so he was pretty hopeful that his family was still alive. White also noted that the colonists had actually looked after his things, and they had buried them. However, local tribespeople seem to have found the buried treasure and looted it. John White wrote in his journal, quote, "About the place many of my things spoiled and broken, and my books torn from the covers, the frames of some of my pictures and maps rotten and spoiled with rain, and my armor almost eaten through with rust." End quote. Now, due to bad weather, which according to John White grew to be fouler and fouler, White and his crew abandoned the decision to search the nearby islands for the missing colonists. The ship's captain had already lost 3 anchors on the journey there and couldn't afford to lose another one, so John White just said fuck it and returned to England. They arrived in Plymouth on October 24th, 1590. It's been said that the loss of the colony was a personal tragedy for him, and he never fully recovered from it. He would never return to America again, and he wrote in a letter to Richard Hakluyt, an English writer, that he must, quote, hand over the fate of the colonist and his family to the merciful help of the Almighty, whom I must humbly beseech to help and comfort them, end quote. That being said though, it must be mentioned that even though John White failed to find his colonists, his reports suggested that they had simply relocated and might yet be found alive. However, it served Sir Walter Raleigh's purpose to keep this whole situation a mystery, because as long as the settlers could not be proven dead, he could legally maintain his claim on Virginia. Even though, this colony did not go to Virginia, they went to Roanoke. And now we understand what the whole fuck up is. Meanwhile though, John Dare, the son of Ananias Dare, made a petition to declare his dad legally dead so he could inherit his estate. This petition would be granted in 1597, probably much to Sir Walter Raleigh's chagrin. But Uncle Rolly Polly started charting expeditions, which he claimed were to try to find the lost colony of Roanoke, but it later turned out that he was actually searching for El Dorado. But I suppose he wanted it known that he did pass by Roanoke a few times and the outer banks of North Carolina, but was never able to land there due to bad weather, as is of course tradition. The last time he tried to go to Roanoke was in about 1602, but because the weather was shit again, they just fucking left. Then in 1603, Sir Walter Raleigh was arrested for treason and his involvement in the Maine Plot. The Maine Plot was a conspiracy to remove King James I from the throne and replace him with his cousin, Lady Arbella Stuart. Now, I don't care about the politics of all that shit, but before his execution, Sir Walter Raleigh was quoted as saying to his hesitating executioner, quote, "What dost thou fear? Strike, man, strike!" So, just watch out because we got a badass over here. Point is, he tried to go to Roanoke and the Croatoan Islands a couple of times and he was never able to. Now, the mystery for over 4 centuries has been, where did the Roanoke colony go? Well, we've got the answer for you.
But you're not going to like it.
It doesn't matter, we must know it.
All right.
Just as the tree suggested, 440 years ago, they moved to the nearby Croatoan Island, and they integrated into the Croatan tribe that they were known to be allies with. People have been saying this for a very, very, very long time, but let's look at all of the evidence that suggests that is exactly what happened. Number 1, there is no Maltese cross on the tree, suggesting that they went willingly. Number 2, the Croatan people were their friends. Number 3, 2 independent teams of archaeologists found archaeological remains that prove at least some of the abandoned colonists survived, most likely then splitting into 2 separate groups that assimilated with the local Native Americans. Now recently, a collection of things like European sword hilts, broken English bowls, and a fragment of a slate writing tablet that was still inscribed with a letter just merely suggested the presence of the Roanoke colonists on Croatoan Island. But suggestion is not definitive proof. So what is the definitive proof? Well, according to the archaeologist Mark Horton, they have uncovered proof that the colonists assimilated into the Croatoan society by studying trash. Mark Horton said, quote, "We're looking at the middens. That's the rubbish heaps of the Native Americans living on Hatteras Island, because we deduced that they would have very rapidly been assimilated into the Native American population." End quote. Now, Mark Horton claims that this here is the definitive proof. This is called hammer scale. This tiny, flaky bits of iron that comes from forging iron. This is the definitive proof of iron working on Hatteras Island, which could have only been done by the English colonists. Mark Horton said, quote, "This is metal that has to be raised to a relatively high temperature, which of course requires technology that Native Americans at this period did not have." End quote. So now a very rational question to ask is it possible that this shit came from a later time period? Mark Horton says, quote, "Unlikely. We found it stratified underneath layers that we know date to the late 16th or early 17th century. So we know that this dates to the period when the lost colonists would have come to Hatteras Island. It's a combination of both its archaeological position, but also the fact that it's evidence of people actually using an English technology." End quote. So pretty convincing. But if you're still not convinced, I've got some more. At the same site, archaeologists also found guns, nautical fittings, small cannonballs, an engraved slate and a stylus, and even wine glasses and beads, which, according to Mark Horton, all paint a vivid picture of life on Hatteras Island in the 17th century. When asked if the colonists could have been killed in a later war, Horton said, quote, "They survived among the Croatoans and successfully assimilated." We have one little snippet of historical evidence from the 1700s, which describes people with blue or grey eyes who could remember people who used to be able to read from books. They also said that their ancestors were white. Also, they said that there was this ghost ship that was sent out by a man called Raleigh. End quote. Now, as we already know, Raleigh did try more than once to land at Croatoan and Roanoke to find the colonists. Mark Horton then concluded with, quote, "We think that they assimilated into the Native American community and their descendants, their sons, their granddaughters, their grandsons, carried on living on Hatteras Island until the early 18th century. And although the archaeological evidence is definitive, the legend will probably still endure." Well, well, well. Look at us solving a mystery in under 20 minutes today. Technically it took 440 years, but hey, at least we got it done. Anyway, feel free to add your thoughts to the comments, like the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you again soon with another mystery.
And yeah, that's really about it. See ya.